It was a typical afternoon when a group of bikers decided to have some fun at the local construction site. What they didn't know was that the man they were about to pick on was no ordinary worker. Mike, a seasoned construction engineer, had spent years serving in the Army, building and maintaining infrastructure in some of the toughest environments around the world. But here, in this small town, he was just another guy in a hard hat, blending in with the crew. The bikers, thinking they could push him around like they did with others, quickly found out that they were making a dangerous mistake. They had no idea that Mike wasn't just a tough guy on the job. He had skills and experience that could turn the tables fast. As tensions rise, things start to spiral, and it's clear this won't be just another confrontation. Who will come out on top? Stay tuned to see how this showdown unfolds. Mike wasn't the type to back down from a confrontation, but he also knew how to pick his battles. After all, the Army had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to assess situations before acting. He had worked on massive projects in hostile zones, constructing bridges and roads in places where even the locals feared to tread. But now, standing face to face with a group of rowdy bikers who were pushing their luck, Mike felt a familiar tension creep up his spine. The leader of the bikers, a tall guy with a leather jacket that seemed to stretch tighter with every movement, was the first to speak. His voice was full of bravado as he mocked the construction site and the workers on it. Mike tried to keep his cool, but the taunts were getting under his skin. He knew these kinds of guys. They thought they could walk all over people just because they had a reputation. But Mike wasn't about to let them make him a target. As the situation started to escalate, Mike's instincts kicked in, and something in the air shifted. Mike kept his gaze steady, refusing to show any signs of weakness. But inside, his mind was racing. He wasn't here to prove a point, but something about these bikers' cocky attitude got to him. They had no idea what he was capable of, and that was exactly what made this so dangerous. One wrong move, and this could quickly escalate into something much worse. But as the leader of the bikers pushed forward, spitting insults and edging closer, Mike knew he needed to act fast. On the other side of the site, a few of his coworkers had started to notice the tension. Joe, a younger guy who'd only been working there for a few months, looked nervously from Mike to the bikers. He'd seen fights break out before, but this felt different. Something about Mike's calmness under pressure was unnerving. He had no idea about Mike's past in the Army, and the last thing he wanted was to witness someone getting hurt. Meanwhile, the bikers were growing bolder. The leader stepped forward, shoving Mike lightly with his chest, his grin widening. "You gonna take that, tough guy," he sneered, oblivious to the potential consequences of his actions. Mike didn't flinch. He knew better than to react immediately. But his mind was calculating, weighing the possible moves. Strategies learned in tense situations, where every second counted. He wasn't sure how this would play out, but he wasn't going to let things spiral out of control. Then, just as Mike prepared to say something to diffuse the situation, one of the other bikers, a smaller guy who hadn't said much, reached for something in his pocket. The others didn't seem to notice, too wrapped up in their leader's bravado. Mike's eyes flipped to the movement. This wasn't just a random confrontation anymore. It was turning into a powder keg. And with his military training, Mike knew better than to wait around for the spark. Mike's eyes locked onto the biker reaching into his pocket, his hand now hovering just above a bulge in his jacket. Instincts kicked in, the years of military training surfacing in an instant. He knew it wasn't a phone or a wallet. No, this was a weapon. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and the world seemed to slow down. Time was running out. One wrong move, and this could end badly for everyone. Joe was watching, frozen in place, his hands gripping a piece of pipe nervously. The tension in the air was palpable. He had no idea how to help, but he didn't want to just stand by and do nothing. He felt trapped between wanting to step in and the knowledge that things could escalate beyond control. His eyes darted between Mike and the bikers, hoping someone would do something, anything, to stop this from turning into a fight. The leader of the bikers stepped even closer to Mike, clearly sensing the tension but thinking it was all just a standoff. "You've got something to prove, don't you?" he taunted, his voice dripping with false confidence. Mike didn't respond. He wasn't here to talk. His mind was already mapping out the best way to take down the threat before it became an emergency. Suddenly, the biker's hand shot out of his pocket, and a glint of metal caught the sunlight. A small knife, nothing too fancy, but enough to make the situation turn deadly. The leader grinned, thinking he had the upper hand. But Mike's reaction was instantaneous. Without missing a beat, he took a step back, grabbed a nearby length of rebar with one hand, and spun it around in a fluid motion. Joe's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't take his eyes off the scene unfolding before him. He had never seen Mike move like this, calm, precise, like he was performing some kind of military drill. It was as if the world around them had gone silent, leaving only the sound of the approaching danger. The other bikers were starting to notice the shift in energy. One of them took a half step back, uncertain, but the leader wasn't backing down. His eyes narrowed, the smile turning into a cold sneer. "You think you can stop me?" he growled, clearly not realizing who he was up against. And that's when Mike made his move. With a swift twist, he disarmed the biker, knocking the knife from his hand. The situation was spiraling, but Mike wasn't about to let it get out of control. The other bikers took a step back, realizing this wasn't just some random construction worker they could push around. But Mike wasn't done yet. The air was thick with tension, and with each passing second, it was clear this wasn't going to end without a fight. But who would make the first move? And what would happen when it did? As the knife skidded across the gravel and came to a halt, the leader of the bikers stumbled back, clearly stunned by how quickly Mike had neutralized the threat. For a split second, the standoff seemed to pause, with everyone unsure of what would happen next. But just as Mike tightened his grip on the rebar, ready to take control of the situation, the unexpected happened. From behind him, the sound of revving engines broke the silence. At first, it was faint, like distant thunder. But it grew louder, echoing through the construction site like a storm on the horizon. Mike's head snapped toward the noise, his instincts telling him this wasn't a coincidence. He quickly scanned the area, realizing with a sickening twist in his gut that more bikers were arriving, at least half a dozen of them, their motorcycles cutting through the dust and gravel. The leader had clearly called for backup, and now Mike found himself outnumbered. Joe, still holding onto the pipe, felt a wave of dread wash over him. This wasn't just a few rowdy bikers anymore. This was turning into something far more dangerous. Mike was a skilled fighter, but he was no magician. The odds had just shifted dramatically, and the calm confidence that Mike had shown before now seemed fragile in the face of overwhelming numbers. The new arrivals surrounded the site, engines roaring as they parked their bikes in strategic positions. Mike's mind raced. His military training kicked in once again. He needed to keep control, stay one step ahead. But there was a new element now. The tension had risen from just a simple face-off to a full-on battle for survival. The bikers weren't just pushing for dominance. They were looking for a way to end this. Fast. That as Mike steadied his breath and prepared for the worst, another twist. From the edge of the site, a familiar face appeared, a figure Mike hadn't expected to see. It was another worker from the site, but someone with a different history. This guy, Tom, had been in trouble before. And judging by the way he was walking toward the bikers with a certain purpose, Mike realized with growing unease that Tom was no ally in this situation. Tom's expression was cold, almost predatory, and as he made his way to the leader of the bikers, Mike's stomach dropped. What was he doing here? Was he part of this? And why was he joining forces with the bikers now? The stakes had just been raised. Mike was no longer fighting a random group of troublemakers. Now it seemed like a much more calculated setup. What did they want? And more importantly, how was Mike going to stop them all before things got completely out of hand? Mike's mind was racing, trying to process everything. The new arrivals had completely shifted the odds, but it wasn't just the bikers who were making this worse. Tom, walking toward the leader like he was part of the crew, had Mike's heart pounding. There was something off about Tom's approach, too calm, too confident. Mike knew this wasn't just a random power play. Tom had been trouble from the start, and now it seemed he was connected to the bikers in some way Mike hadn't anticipated. As the bikers closed in, the leader smirked at Mike, sensing the growing tension. "You're outnumbered, pal," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Time to give up. But Mike wasn't giving up. He had seen worse odds in his military days, and there was always a way out. He wasn't about to let this slip into chaos without a plan. In a flash, Mike dropped the red bar and lunged at the biker closest to him, disarming him with swift precision. The sound of a struggle echoed through the site, but before the bikers could react, Mike threw a handful of dirt into one of their faces, blinding him for just long enough to land a solid punch that sent him sprawling. It was a blur of movement, a calculated series of strikes and counters, each one pushing the bikers back just enough to keep them off balance. But it wasn't enough. With more bikers surrounding him, Mike knew it wouldn't take long before he was overpowered. His eyes darted back to Tom, who had reached the leader. The two exchanged a few quiet words, and suddenly Tom's hand shot out, handing the leader something small and metallic. A gun. Mike froze. He hadn't expected that. The bikers weren't just here for a fight. They were here for something much more dangerous. They'd come prepared. But the moment Tom passed the weapon to the leader, Mike knew the game had changed. The leader aimed the gun at Mike, and for a split second, time seemed to stop. Everyone paused. Mike's pulse thudded in his ears. His training kicked in. He couldn't afford to hesitate. With a sudden burst of movement, he dropped to the ground, rolling to the side just as the first shot rang out, narrowly missing him. The bikers were momentarily distracted by the sound of the gunshot, giving Mike the opening he needed. He grabbed a piece of metal from the ground, using it to knock the gun out of the leader's hand in a swift motion. The leader lunged at him, but Mike was already one step ahead, using the momentum to throw him off balance and slam him to the ground. Just as the bikers were about to rush in, a loud, unfamiliar voice called from the edge of the site. "Hey, enough." It was Joe, holding a large piece of construction equipment, like a bulldozer, and it was aimed straight at the bikers. Apparently, Joe had found a way to turn the tables. The bikers froze, unsure whether to engage with Mike or face the new threat. But before they could make a decision, the sirens of approaching police cars wailed in the distance. It seemed like someone had finally called the authorities, and the bikers were realizing the odds were rapidly turning against them. But just as it seemed like the situation was resolved, something unexpected happened. Tom, standing next to the fallen leader, looked at Mike and the others with a sly grin. "You think it's over," he sneered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Before anyone could react, Tom pulled out a second gun, pointing it at the ground. But instead of firing, he tossed the gun aside and turned to the bikers. "You've all been set up," he said, his voice cold. The group fell silent, and for the first time, Mike saw a flicker of uncertainty in the biker's eyes. Tom's grin widened. "You're the distraction," he said. "The real job's happening elsewhere." With that, he turned and walked off, leaving the bikers standing in confusion, their power play unraveling before them. As the police arrived and began to round up the bikers, Mike couldn't help but feel a chill. Tom's words echoed in his mind. What job, and who else was involved? As the scene began to settle, Mike realized this wasn't just a random altercation. It was the start of something much bigger, and the real story was only beginning. As the police handcuffed the remaining bikers and began clearing the site, Mike stood still, his mind still racing. He watched Tom disappear into the distance, knowing the story wasn't over. The bikers were just pawns in a much larger game, and whatever real job Tom had mentioned, Mike knew it had something to do with the underworld connections that ran deeper than he'd ever imagined. Joe, still holding the piece of pipe, walked up to Mike, his face a mix of relief and confusion. "What the hell was that all about?" he asked. Mike didn't have a simple answer. "Not everything's what it seems," Mike said quietly, glancing toward the police. "And sometimes what you think is just a fight is just the beginning." As the scene cleared and the adrenaline wore off, Mike felt a new weight settling in. He had survived the encounter, but the bigger question remained: who was Tom working for, and what had he been trying to set up? The answers would come soon enough, but for now, Mike knew one thing for sure. This was only the first round.